picking up where I started, lots of people are also in different fields than what they have studied. In my case, I studied economics. I am ended up in innovation now, as it happens. And when I first started flirting with the professional environment, I was still at university, and we had a company run by the student body. And we would do freelance work, either as a consultant, mostly as analysts, or writing articles. And I loved writing. And so I wrote a couple of articles for one of the business magazines, a leading business magazine in the country. And just before I graduated, I got invited by the chief editor to join the team. And I was flattered, of course. That was wonderful. What an amazing opportunity. So I met lots of senior leaders. I got to interview some of business owners or even government, because I was also doing a lot of macroeconomic analysis. I got to travel. I got all the perks that come with journalism, which were at that time quite a few. But during 2 years, I also started to find at times I was getting conflict between what I was doing, and I loved writing. But there was also an area of you need to write to sell the title. And that started to get into conflict with my own values. And I realized that long term, that would not be sustainable. I really enjoyed meeting new people, the variety of the role, but also what you get to learn through the conversations and the interviews that I was able to do. And so I realized that consultancy would actually give me that ability. And I joined Hay Management Group. So they are today part of Corn and Ferry. And they would do a lot of consultancy in human resources area. And so I joined as a junior consultant. And throughout 4 years, I managed to get the head of Reward. And Reward was the business area, the biggest practice, where, all the job evaluations, and it's still a reference system within the human resources market. And at that time, my husband got an offer to go to the Netherlands. So you're ramping up your career, you're flying high, and there is another person who you bound to share life with that gets a great opportunity to go. It will force you to make a choice. I always knew family would come first, and so I gave up and followed him to Rotterdam. During the first 6 months, I focused on my girl. She was then just under 2 years old, so it was great to spend time with her and having more of that joy of being a mother without having to split ends with, working life. But after 6 months, I was sick of talking bottles and nappies. That wasn't me. It was great, but it wasn't enough for me, fulfilling my own personal needs. And so I said, I need to do something else. And I started to look for a job. Of course, I didn't have a network. I didn't speak the language in the market, in the country. So I really started to build that network to try and find a job. And luckily enough, I got the choice between going all in into human resources, or there was also an offer that was more of a consultant internally in a big company that happened to be Unilever. And of course, if you have seen my CV, you realize what choices I made, but there was a rationale to it. So if our intention as a family was to manage 2 careers, run across the world, the ratio of HR jobs per company and the specificity, especially in the reward area of local legislations, could be a hindering factor in terms of the options that I would have available to me. And so at that time, I realized I may not know very well what is, because it was knowledge management. It's a highly technical ground that I wasn't familiar with, but I realized that by opening my breadth of experience, I would probably support better my life and my long-term goals of moving with a family. So that was where choices are made, and you have to really know, I guess, what is important to you, what are the big rocks in your life. So I started a job in Unilever as a knowledge management consultant, and that allowed me to get to know all the functions and across many different categories. It was a perfect start for someone that enjoys learning, enjoys the variety. And I guess a little bit like what you presented earlier, I wasn't so clear what I wanted to do. I was enjoying opportunities as they presented to me. And over time, innovation started right from there, understanding what else can we do, understanding what knowledge managers do, but also how does that extend to other areas, and started to venture into marketing, because at that time, Unilever had acquired Best Foods. They were going through the merge, and Best Foods had a very local for local approach, and Unilever wanted to build more of the global scale and synergies. So a lot of my projects were about finding common innovation platforms, first across all the European countries, and later on using the similar approach to build global innovation platforms. So I guess that's how I land later on in marketing, innovation, brands, consumer, and all those sort of things. So I guess in changing and trends, we can't ignore the pandemic. I know this is well talked about every day, day in, day out by everyone, and people are sick of it. But the reality is that the pandemic probably accelerated many of the trends that we have been seeing. And one of them that I will call out, because I think 2020, for me personally, but for many, many people, it was the pure manifestation of what we call the VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Then in more specific terms, I've also looked and reflected a bit on the industry itself, what is happening specifically on the food end of things. And I think, as you said, people during the pandemic needed to cook more, not by their own choice, but by force. They got a little bit more curious, and there was an amazing peak in baking. One of the top items that would run out in supermarket shelves would be wheat flour. For some reason, bread, baking, and any kind of baking really picked up. The other thing is that people became more discerning, but also more conscious about eating healthy and healthier foods. And I don't need to mention, of course, the need for immunity and vitamin C. Now, some of these trends, I think, may be fading as soon as the pandemic goes away or kind of fades away, which we don't know how close that will be. But the reality and the realization that foods play more than a feeding role and can be really functional is here to stay. It's something that we have been observing for a few years, but it's definitely something that people now also developed a lot more discernment to understand, what are the foods that will make me feel better. And there are even movements about functional nutrition, realizing there are foods that also impact the way you feel, the way your body functions, but also your mood. And if there is also an unspoken consequence of all the pandemic, and especially the lockdowns, is the mental health. That is the next global health crisis that WHO is seeing. So in that camp, I truly believe that food will play an even bigger role in terms of this functionality. The economy, though, is people remain time scarce. So time became almost the most scarce resource in everyone's lives. So time for sitting down, having structured meals is also getting less. And that will force people to take either more pragmatic approaches or more convenient, as in on-the-go kind of solutions. I have my 17-year-old asking me, why can't we just have a peel or a shake that we put down and it's a meal replacement? I don't have to cook, I don't have to sit down, and I don't have to do the dishes. And lastly, I think there is also, of course, the movement towards a more protein-based diet. And if you see it, some of the capital investment going into Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat is just unbelievable. And so that was one trend that was already there, big time. And the other was the realization that a meat-based diet is also taking a bigger toll on the planet and resources. And so I think that leads to my probably third trend, which is around the need for a more sustainable world and sustainability evolving from not just environmental causes, which continue to be an emergency, an absolute way to act, but also even more societal development. And so you have the social development goals from United Nations to kind of put a framework to the efforts that corporations, governments, and even individuals can make to contribute to a more peaceful and prosperous world. Prosperous world. There are people that are extremely determined and they absolutely know what they want. But to be honest, and being a woman and having led many women through their own careers, I can tell you that women very often don't have that clear visibility of being absolutely determined of what they want. They're more likely to also have to juggle the priorities between careers and being mothers. And that's really a dichotomy. This is to say, go and explore. And if you love something, you're sure you want to be able to do that, go for it. But there is also something that people say, follow your passions. And I would be very careful and rewording that, find your passion in everything you do. Because reality of the work life is also that a lot of us find times where you have to work to pay your bills and there is no time for passion. So you can either take that with a huge frustration of not being able to work in the field you want, or turn it to your opportunity and to your advantage and find the passion within whatever you need to do. When I was at my consultancy role back in Portugal, I would spend 8 hours in a day doing job descriptions. That means sitting down with people and asking them a few questions to understand what they do, the impact they have in the organization, and having to put that, at that time, you had to put it all down to paper to then send for evaluation and understand how much that job would be worth it in terms of pay. In very simplistic terms, that would be the process. And obviously the junior people would end up doing all those interviews and doing the write-ups, which most of my peers found absolutely dreadful, horrendous, and hated. I took the opportunity at every of those meetings to understand what those roles were. I remember one project was at a big tire factory. Instead of sitting down in a room, I would invite especially the shop floor operators to take me to their machine and show me what they were doing. It was amazing. It was a learning for me. It was a journey of exploration and learning. So instead of taking those days as daunting days of interviews back to back that I had to write up, I took those as learning opportunities to understand what jobs were there, high or low in the corporate world, that I could potentially aspire to in terms of my own development and career. So this is just an illustrative example of, I think, keeping an open mind and finding joy in everything you do. The other thing is, and I guess my story already shows that the importance I find within my own values, having those very clear and realizing where things come at odds with your own values, I think that is a drain of energy. So you have to be clear on what is really important to you. And that for me was a key learning, similar to, finding the big rocks in your life. If you look at, and the analogy or the motto for me is really the thinking of a glass jar that you're trying to fill with big rocks, pebbles, and sand. if you start with the sand, you will never be able to fit in the big rocks. If you start with the big rocks, you then can observe the pebbles filling in some of the spaces. But if you put sand in, the sand will adapt itself because it's malleable. So it's the same thing with your life. Put your big rocks first. Know what are the one or two big things for you that are important. And mind you, these may change along your life as well. Life is dynamic. It's not a straight path, and it's not written for you to walk. You have to write it as you walk it. So I think being mindful of that is very important. Personally, for me, another key learning, I would never be the person I am today if I had stayed in my own country. I've lived across Lisbon, Brazil, the Netherlands, the Middle East, and even within Singapore, I've been across the border in Malaysia. And I had global roles and regional roles. The fact that I had so much exposure to different cultures has challenged my perspective. So I think one of the problems sometimes when we are interacting with others is we judge reality with our own perspectives. If we try to put ourselves in the shoes of others, we may say things differently. And I would never have the personal growth that I found in all these multicultural experiences if I hadn't lived and allowed myself to emerge in such different cultures. And finally, I think the single most important skill is really building resilience and adaptability, because change will never be slower than it is today. And you have to take the learnings because every one of us fails. Life is not perfect. And at times, life will throw you lemons. And you have to find the courage, the resilience, and the strength to turn it into a lemonade, or else you just end up absolutely being sour to yourself and to others, which will do no one any good. So for me, resilience is the name of the game. And 2020, 2021, for me personally, but for many, many people around the world, has been really the core key skill. And I would say the biggest learning we can all take from the experiences.